began my trading career kind of through the back door. Didn't expect to be a trader in my life. Actually, when I was in graduate school in psychology, back in 1995, I actually started doing work as a consultant, a psychological consultant for institutions, portfolio managers, institutional traders, even worked with a lot of analysts. And that's really how I got my exposure to trading. So I kind of came in kind of at the top, so to speak, at the institutional level, not as an independent trader, and then I kind of worked my way into becoming a trader myself. And so what I do nowadays is primarily focus on my own trading. I do some consulting with trading firms, and I do some one-on-one coaching with independent traders. So today what we're going to talk about is why a list of rules is usually not enough for most traders, and how developing true self-confidence, and I'm going to talk about what actual self-confidence means, why true self-confidence is just as important, if not more important, than having the right set of rules. Okay, because we've all seen those lists of rules that are great. You know, let your winners run, cut your losers quickly. All that is wonderful, but the problem is, in the heat of the moment, we're usually unable to actually do that, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And one of the ways I'm going to talk about it is using the framework of self-confidence. And I'm going to talk about very specific steps that you can take to increase your self-confidence as a trader. And the reason I'm going to talk a lot about self-confidence is that I believe that confidence is really a precursor to discipline. All right, so let's get into the material here. Before I do, one quick disclaimer. Unfortunately, you guys do need to look at this. I'm not going to read it out loud, but as you're looking at the disclaimer, I'm just going to tell you that if a trader has a trading method with a positive expectancy, or a method or strategy that they actually have confidence in, and they're still struggling, the typical trader is going to assume that they lack some piece of market knowledge. And they're going to end up spending a lot of time searching for what they think is the missing piece of the puzzle. What I'm going to tell you today is that the way you find that missing piece, or what some might call the Holy Grail, is really to go and look at yourself in the mirror. And you will be staring right at the missing piece of the trading puzzle. So there's really 4 takeaways that I'd like everybody to get from this webinar today, and I'm going to really try and focus on some practical ideas, practical, actionable items that you can take away with you and start using in your trading tomorrow or tonight if you're a Globex trader or whatever market you trade. So the 4 takeaways, as you guys can see on the screen, talking about why rules are not enough, that's the lead into the presentation here. But really what I'm going to also be talking about is a very specific relationship between your emotions and your behavior. And I'm going to be ending the presentation with some very specific practical tips on what you can do to increase your confidence and help you to basically follow your rules. I'm going to actually be interspersing some practical tips throughout the presentation, but the final slide has a nice long list of tips that you can actually take with you. Now, I also want to say that I've never, ever, in my years of being involved in the trading world, which is about 15 years now, I've never met a trader who has never broken one of their rules, and I include myself in that. My goal today is to leave you with a newfound perspective on why self-confidence is critical and how it relates to discipline. At some point or another, most traders are really their own worst enemy. And what I do is I work with traders to help them to become their own best friend, which will in turn help them to consistently act in their own best interest. And that's important because the market is essentially an environment where we are exposed to constant uncertainty, constant ambiguity, and it's very difficult to be focused and continually making the right decision. That's really going to be in the best interest of your P&L. Okay, so before I get into the specific material, I had one request from somebody who asked me to talk a little bit about a pre-market mental preparation routine. And so I'm going to call this the Get Your Game Face On routine. And what I have here on this slide is basically this is a rather generic routine. This is not something that that everybody needs to use for themselves, but this is a kind of an open generic idea. HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If anyone recognizes where that comes from, that comes right out of professional poker. Essentially what it's saying there is you need to kind of assess your your state, your internal state. And if you're not feeling good, if you didn't sleep well the night before, you know, your blood sugar's low, you're hungry, what have you, those are all issues where you need to be recognizing the fact that maybe you're not in the right mental state to be trading. Because trading is highly competitive, and you need to have every ounce of your being with you. You need to be 100% on your game. I also suggest that people do a lot of mental rehearsal. I suggest that you do this before you trade, in the morning. It's also good to do it in the evening before you go to bed. And I encourage people to use not just positive but also negative scenarios. And the reason why it's important to focus on both positive and negative scenarios when you're doing your mental rehearsal is that you have to be prepared for anything. You know, you need to make the scenarios as vivid as possible. And what I also do with traders, and I do this myself, is you might want to consider using a biofeedback device, one that possibly measures heart rate variability. And I can talk about that at the end when we have questions. I'm sure there will be some about that, where basically using a biofeedback device, you can really help to condition the responses that you're trying to reinforce, and you can help to kind of extinguish or get rid of the negative responses that you're trying to get rid of. And you can do that very effectively using biofeedback. Positive imagery is also really important. That's basically where you're going to want to focus on images where you are acting in your own best interest. And I'm going to add that it's also a nice thing where you might want to do this, where you focus on images of others that you respect, other traders that you have a lot of respect for. And I'm going to tell you why imaging can be very powerful. First of all, there's a lot of science behind this. And PET scans, CAT scans will show that the brain uses the same neural pathways for seeing objects outside of us as the brain will use for internal imaging. The image of the object, basically, it's going to go from your retina to the visual cortex and then basically to the higher cognitive centers of your brain until it is recognized. And that's how we see things that are outside of us. Well, mental imagery pretty much follows the same neural pathway but in reverse. So I kind of think of it as see it, then do it. Also on this list here, you'll see I have induced a relaxed, focused state of mind, and you can do that using breathing, various long, slow, deep breathing techniques, and you can also do that with biofeedback. And really, what I ultimately want to suggest to people is that you have some kind of a ritual for yourself in the morning. I'm assuming that, of course, I'm assuming that you're trading here in the States, but I know there are people here who are overseas. So whatever time you start your trading day, before you actually go to your trading seat, wherever it may be, whether it's in your home, whether you're in an office, whether you're in a firm, I believe it's very important to have some type of a trading ritual. And I can tell you that a lot of athletes, as you probably are aware of, have rituals that they will use. And I'm not talking about a superstition like, you know, wearing mismatched socks or doing something that's kind of a superstitious nature. But, you know, you notice a baseball player going up to the bat, and what do? They tap their bat on the plate, right? Well, really what's going on there is they're getting focused and they're really binding their anxiety. They're getting ready to get into the flow and do what they have to do. So I suggest that everybody have some type of a ritual that you get into that you associate with relaxation as well as with a focused state of mind. Okay, so this question you guys see here in red, am I acting in my own best interest right now? This, I believe, is fundamentally, without question, the most important question you can ask. And it is so important that if you ask this question throughout your trading day, and I'm referring to actually talking out loud, saying it out loud if you can, or if you're in a firm or on a desk and you don't want to be talking out loud, basically at least saying it to yourself. The more you can do this, especially right before you make a decision, or you make an entry or an exit, or you scale, or whatever you're doing with your trading, by asking yourself that question is going to help you to stay in the moment. It's going to help you to continue to do the right thing rather than trying to focus on being right. And I'm going to tell you that that's a big problem for a lot of traders. You know, many traders get caught up in trying to be right. And really, what I want you to understand from this presentation is that being overly concerned with being right is usually going to get in the way of doing what's right. focusing on doing what's right is always going to get you where you want to go. So one of those things is really asking yourself this question, am I acting in my own best interest right now? You know, trading is not about being right or wrong, okay? That's a big misnomer. A lot of people think of it that way. It's really about how much are you willing to risk to find out. As traders, what we do essentially is, you know, we put our money on the line, but first, hopefully, what you do is before you put your money on the line is you predefine your risk. And you have to truly embrace that risk on an emotional level. And I'm not talking about just, you know, having a mental stop or even having a hard stop in and getting hit and accepting that. I'm talking about truly emotionally accepting that risk. You know, trading involves a lot of uncertainty. And if you get really upset with a losing trade, it's quite possible that it's suggesting that you didn't really fully accept the risk before you entered the trade. A losing trade, and this is going to be kind of a controversial statement I'm going to say here, and I'm sure some folks are going to have issues with this, and that's fine. You can ask me questions at the end about it. A losing trade should actually be empowering if the trade was done correctly and you have self-confidence in yourself and in your method. And the reason for that simply is this. A losing trade gives you information about the market that you didn't have before. Now, again, this really only applies to a trader who has confidence and who has a methodology that they believe in and who is trading within their predefined risk parameters. You know, a trader's job is never to know, we're never going to know where price is going. It's not our job to know where price is going to go next. Our job is to be prepared to act in our own best interest when price approaches a certain level that you have determined to be important. So really the bottom line here is that trading rules are not going to help you if you have not emotionally embraced and internalized the rules. An intellectual understanding is not going to be enough. I see a question about what is HRV, and I'll get to that at the end, you guys. That's a good question. It stands for heart rate variability, and I'll talk about that at the end. If I don't talk about it, please ask it again, and Trevor will pick up the question and rephrase it to me. So why is it difficult for a trader to follow rules? Okay, there's a lot of reasons, and on this list is obviously not a complete list. I just have some of the more common issues why it's difficult to follow rules. A lot of these are self-explanatory. You know, a lot of times I want to say here too that rules can lead. You know, basically I want to make a preface statement here, and I'm going to tell you that I'm a discretionary trader, and a lot of what I'm talking about is really directed towards discretionary traders, not people who are trading a system, an automated system. Okay, although some of this does apply to them as well. But essentially, as a discretionary trader, it's very easy to become very rigid and overly mechanized in our approach if we have rules that are too rigid. And there's really a fundamental dilemma that we face as traders. We have to, on the one hand, we have to be very rigid with our risk management, very rigid with our risk management, but we also have to be very adaptive and flexible with our expectations. And for many traders, due to personality and psychological reasons, that is a dilemma that will basically be the obstacle that you'll never get around. And so there are things you can do about that, but that is really the dilemma that a discretionary trader faces. You have to maintain very strict adherence to your risk management, and you have to also simultaneously be adaptive and have flexible expectations. And I'm going to tell you a little tidbit that a lot of people are not aware of, and this comes right out of the institutional world, and that is, and I've seen this firsthand, is that basically the largest traders out there, and I'm talking institutional traders that move a lot of money around, we're talking about bank traders that are, you know, doing millions and millions of dollars in a given trade, the very largest of the traders are really focusing first and foremost on risk management more than anything. You know, the setups are and the entry and the positioning and the scaling and all that, those are all important, but it's really the risk management is what's most important. So I really want to emphasize that people have to be able to accept the risk, and that's a big part of trading. You know, rules are never going to help you if you can't emotionally embrace them. Okay, I'm going to say that a few times through this webinar, and I know a lot of folks out there have lists of rules that they have written on a piece of paper, but I'm going to ask you, you know, how many times do you break those rules? Probably lots of times. And you know, and it's part of being human. It's part of human nature, and it's not. There's nothing wrong with you. It's actually, you're quite normal. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things you can do to protect yourself around those situations where you're possibly going to break your own rules. You know, obviously there's a lot of research and a lot that's been written about, a lot of good articles on various mental biases. I like to call them mental traps. I don't want to go through a long list of them and what they mean because that information is easily available on the internet, but I'm just going to have 4 up here for you right now that I want everyone to become familiar with on their own. This is a homework assignment for you. You need to go after this webinar at some point today, tomorrow, next week, whatever. I want you to get very familiar with these concepts. And these are concepts that trip up all traders, no matter how good they are. And I'm not going to spend, I don't want to talk about any one particular mental bias right now because that's not really the focus of this particular presentation, although I do want to say one little thing about loss aversion which a lot of people don't understand. And first of all, loss aversion comes from prospect theory. It's an old behavioral finance theory. It's been around for a long time. It's been very well researched. But what most people don't understand is this, is that the research has shown, and this has been replicated over and over and over, that a $1,000 gain basically feels like a $1,000 gain. But a $1,000 loss, in psychological terms, feels more like a $2,500 loss. In other words, the magnitude of psychological impact of a gain or a loss, they are not equivalent. There's about a 2.5x factor for most people on a psychological level. And what this says is that we basically will do a lot of things to avoid taking a loss because a loss is much more painful than a win feels good. And that's a really big issue that trips up a lot of people in trading. So what I want to suggest before I move on past this slide is that you really need to get to know yourself because we are all susceptible to these mental biases. And some of us are more susceptible to one more than another bias. And although we all succumb to these biases, the inner experience, I should say the emotional experience, the unique subjective experience of each person who's experiencing one of these mental traps is going to be different from another person. So it would behoove you to learn about these mental biases and then begin to become aware of when they show up in your trading. There's a lot of ways you can do that through journaling and other ways. All right, so what do you bring to trading? Okay, a lot of us bring a lot more than a plan or a set of rules. We're told to trade what we see, right? That's the common thing. Trade what you see, not what you think, right? I mean, we've all heard that a zillion times. But the issue for many of us is that most traders really don't believe in, or they're lacking confidence in what they're actually seeing. You might see it, but without confidence, you're not going to act on it. And then if you add the fact that it's human nature to avoid pain or discomfort, which is basically what human nature is all about. We're either seeking pleasure or trying to avoid discomfort. You add that into the mix, and you're going to get in the way of acting in your own best interest. It's very common. It's you know, I'll tell you this. If I was forced to rank in importance, what's the most important thing in trading, and the list might be, you know, your setups, your money management, your risk management, your position sizing, your psychology, I'm going to tell you that the setups are really at the bottom of the list. The setups are important, don't get me wrong. You have to have good setups, you have to have a positive expectancy, you have to have a method you're confident in, but position sizing, risk management, and psychology is going to really keep you out of trouble, and that's really what's going to get you ahead in the game, really more than anything. So what I wanted, and that's something that the biggest and the best traders understand. The institutions know that. The best people actually have it internalized, very much so. They may not tell you that in those words, but they understand it on a very internal basis. So, you know, we've all heard the term plan the trade and trade the plan, but I'm going to tell you from my experience watching traders on all different levels, large to small, what happens is they don't plan the trade and trade the plan. What they do instead is they plan the trade and they trade the emotion. Okay, that's a very common issue for most people. I'm going to say that again. Plan the trade and trade the plan is what we all think we're going to do, and it's what we tell ourselves we're going to do. But then when it comes down to it, where the rubber meets the road, what happens is we plan that trade, but then we're actually trading the emotion. And it happens all the time. It's part of human nature. Now, I want to take a moment here to just talk about discipline. I know discipline is the word that gets thrown around a lot in trading. As long as you have discipline, you'll be fine. And that's true, right? But the problem is, how do we have that discipline? How do we build and maintain the discipline? It's been my experience both as a trader and as a psychologist working with traders that there is a necessary precursor to discipline. And that precursor is self-confidence. Trading discipline cannot exist for any length of time without real self-confidence. And its confidence is what makes discipline possible, in that you have to trust both your method and you have to trust yourself. The typical trader spends a lot of time learning about the market, and when they lose money, the typical trader will spend more time learning about the market, and they're thinking that they're really missing a piece of the market puzzle. And unfortunately, that typical trader never really stops to consider whether the reason for their lack of profitability is within them or not. In other words, whether it's within their own mind or not, whether it's a psychological issue or not. And let me tell you, the typical trader is not profitable. This is not a coincidence, okay? It happens over and over and over in the market. Traders repeat the same mistakes over and over and over. Very, very common. And, I'm going to tell you that what we need to do as a trader is we have to learn to control what we can control, and we have to let go of the rest. Okay, there's a lot that's coming at us. There's a lot of data. We always have to make a decision, and there are some things that we can control, and those are the things we really have to focus on. Basically, we have a limited amount of energy. When I say energy, I'm talking about mental attention, your consciousness. There are some things that are way beyond our control, and we shouldn't really be worrying about those. One of the things that you can control, or I should say two things that you can control, essentially, is your body and your immediate physical environment, your trading desk. And so when it comes to your body, you want to make sure that you're controlling your physiological arousal levels, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. When it comes to your trading area, to your trading desk, I believe that you should make your trading area a sanctuary. Sometimes I'll even tell traders to physically mark their trading area with maybe some masking tape on the floor. And when you enter into that trading area, into your trading zone, so to speak, essentially you're putting on your trader hat, and you're taking on that persona or the role of a trader, and you're letting go of your other concerns, and you're focusing at that point, once you step across that line, on consistently doing the right thing that is in your best interest. Not on trying to be right, but again, focusing on doing what is right, not on being right. Now, if your emotions run high when you're inside that zone, when you're inside your little trading sanctuary, and they're going to run high, there's going to be times when the market's going to do some kind of, it's going to make a very quick, sharp, unexpected move. Happens all the time. So when your emotions run high, you need to step away from the trading area. You need to go maybe to another room, step away, get away from your screen, do something physical, help to change your internal state. Maybe shake out your body, do some deep breathing, do some stretching, do a little dance, whatever it takes. But the physical route is very, very fast and a very effective way to help to modify and change your arousal level and your physical internal state. Let's see, I want to move on to the next slide here. I'm just kind of being mindful of the time. I want to make sure I get to all the information because I've got a lot of practical stuff I want to leave you guys with at the end. So this is a big area that I want to spend a little time on here, and it's about emotions. And emotions, I'm not going to get into the neuroscience of emotions and all that. There's a lot of good information on that. But primarily the way I look at emotions in trading is that they essentially have three functions. They distort what we observe, they're a form of self-communication, and they ultimately drive our behavior. And I'm going to say this probably maybe 10 or 12 times throughout this presentation. So you know, and the reason I'm going to say it a lot of times is because I can't overemphasize it enough, because most traders really, pardon me, they really need to internalize this. So that's why I'm going to say this a lot. You need to learn to do more of what works and less of what doesn't. And first of all, you have to identify what works, obviously, and identify what doesn't work, and then learn to do more of what works and less of what doesn't. That sounds obvious, but the problem is most traders do just the opposite. You know, a big reason why many traders cannot do more of what works and less of what doesn't is because of unmanaged emotions. You know, everyone can probably relate to this. After you exit a loser that ran too far, you know, you look back at the chart and you say to yourself, man, why didn't I just get out earlier? You know, after the fact, it all looks so clear. It looks crystal clear. And the reason is because once we're out of the trade, our fear diminishes, and we can see things quite clearly at that point. So what's happening here is that when the emotion dissipates, when there's no more fear present, our perception clears up. So that's proof right there that your emotions are going to distort what you're observing. You know, we can only see what we are capable of seeing, and that includes both within ourselves and in the market. Okay, I basically have a saying that we don't really trade the market, we just basically trade ourselves, and we see what we want to see. We don't really see the market as it is. What we're really seeing is we're seeing a projection of our own internal map onto the market. And the market is something that everyone has their own subjective view on. As traders, what we have to do is we have to learn to use our emotions and not be a victim of them. And I'm going to talk about some of that in more specific ways later in this presentation. But we don't want to be a victim of our emotions. I'm not talking about controlling emotions, because that's I don't want it to confuse people. I'm not saying that. And I'm certainly not saying that we need to eliminate emotions. I don't believe that it's possible. And I say that as a psychologist. I believe that if you've got a pulse, you're going to have emotions. So there's no way to eliminate emotions. But we can learn to manage emotions, and I'm going to give you guys some very specific ways in which you can learn to do that for yourself. And again, one of the reasons why you want to be able to manage your emotions is that they do have a profound effect on your perception and your behavior. You know, again, we're told to trade what we see and not what we think. But the problem is we don't believe or have confidence in what we see. Okay, so this slide right here, one of the most important rules in trading is actually a relationship. Okay, and the relationship is between your feelings and what you see on the screen. So there's a lot of relationships that we have to consider in trading. Essentially what we're doing as a trader, we're really trading off of relationships, right? We're looking at, you know, intra-market relationships, index to index, confirmation between indicators, price action, confluence of levels, whatever it is. Those are all just different relationships. So we trade off of relationships. And a lot of traders, really, what's going on for them in the moment of trading while they're actually, you know, in front of their screen and in a position or getting into one or exiting one, is that they're really not managing the trade as much as they're really managing their feelings in relation to the market, or they're managing their feelings in relation to their P&L. And I want to say that again because that's a really big thing. Most traders think that they're trading the market or they're managing their trade, but really for the typical trader who's kind of not doing that well, and I'm going to say the typical trader who tends to repeat a lot of their same mistakes over and over and over, that's usually someone who's probably managing their feelings in relation to the market or their feelings in relation to their P&L. They're really not managing the trade. You know, there's a great example of that where a trader, you know, you get into a trade because of a fear of missing out, right? And that's, I'm not going to get into all the fears and whatnot, but that's one of the big ones that causes a lot of traders to get into a trade with poor location. I'm not going to, again, that's a whole other topic for another day, but, you know, we have a fear of missing out. So we get into a trade, you know, and then we're in a bad, poor location. And we do all kinds of irrational things to justify being in that situation. And that's a very common example of managing your emotions, or I should say managing really acting on your emotions and not really acting on what the market's telling you to do. You know, another example might be a trader who's already in a trade, and let's say the trade's kind of going in their direction, and they are in a situation where maybe they're red on the week, they're red on the day, they're having a down month, they're in a drawdown, whatever. They're in a trade and it's going in their direction, and they decide, you know what, I don't want to give and it starts to wiggle around on them a little bit. Price starts to wiggle, some news hits the wire, things kind of go haywire for a little bit, but yet they're still in the green on the trade. They get nervous and they jump out taking a really small profit. And that's a very common situation. I kind of call it the eat like an elephant, eat like a bird, poop like an elephant, pardon me. And that's a very common syndrome that happens with a lot of traders. You know, a lot of our trading behaviors ultimately are really ways in which we're just managing our feelings in relation to our own P&L. And the sooner you realize this, the sooner you're going to be better off. And I'm just going to also just say this, that you know, as a psychologist, it's just abundantly clear to me that most maladaptive trading behaviors are really the result of attempting to avoid pain or discomfort. You know, it might be the discomfort of missing out on a move, or the discomfort of having to take a loss, but we're all basically trying to avoid discomfort in one way, shape, or another. And as soon as you understand that, you're going to be better off. And really, you want to be able to realize as well that, are you managing your feelings or are you managing the trade? And again, one of the ways you can kind of check in with yourself to see if you are kind of going down that same path that you've been down before is to stop and ask yourself that question that I had at the beginning of the presentation, which is, am I acting in my own best interest right now? I mean, to me, that is the fundamental rule of trading. I don't have a list of rules taped next to my keyboard. I have the one rule in my mind, which is I continually ask myself, am I acting in my own best interest right now? And I ask that before I'm in a trade, and when I'm in a trade, and when I'm deciding whether I should exit a trade, whether it's with a profit or with a loss. Okay, so confidence and competence. You know, there's a lot of different ways we can talk about sort of the developmental stages of a trader. You know, one that people like to talk about very often is the old one of, you know, first we're unconscious about being incompetent, and then we become conscious that we're incompetent and so forth. And we all know about those 4 levels, and I like those levels. It's a great way to think about it, but I've kind of created a different model that's a little bit simpler. I think it's a little bit more realistic and has a little bit more of a kind of a practical application. And the model that I've developed, essentially you can see it on the screen right here, is there's 3 stages really. That first stage is where someone is really unable to identify a pattern, and that's obviously a trader who's new to trading or is learning a new system of trading. And then there's stage 2 where you're able to identify a pattern, and stage 3 where basically you can identify a pattern and you're able to take the right action. And I want to add to number 3 that the right action ultimately should be an action that's in your own best interest. The typical trader spends most of their time watching for patterns in the market. But I'm going to tell you that trading is a lot more than pattern recognition, okay, a lot more. The typical trader spends a lot of time waiting for their patterns to emerge or waiting for a certain pattern to appear, and they assume that when they see pattern ABC, I'll call it, it's not a real ABC pattern, but I'm just going to use that as a term. When they see pattern ABC, they're going to do XYZ. Now there's 2 problems here. The first problem is that each time that pattern ABC shows up, it's going to look a bit different than the last time it appeared. And number 2, each time that pattern ABC shows up, it's not always going to correspond to the same internal state inside of us as it did last time. So what I'm going to propose to you, and this is something that you can decide to do on your own or not, and I strongly encourage you to consider it, is that you begin to track your own internal patterns as much as you track the market patterns. Everyone loves to backtest. Everyone loves to look for patterns, but very few people actually track their own internal patterns. And what I mean by internal patterns is getting a handle on your feelings, your emotions, and you can either chart them literally actually even like using kind of like a price chart with your emotions. You can journal them. There's a lot of ways you can keep track of your internal patterns, your internal states. And one of the benefits you're going to get from that, if you're able to do it, is, believe it or not, you're going to start to see common repeated patterns, or I should say situations where you will see internal states, certain emotions, certain feelings that are associated with certain types of trading mistakes that you make over and over and over. So basically what you want to be able to do is, when you begin to recognize, or you kind of have that red flag waving in the air, that the very beginning of that internal state, that certain feeling is beginning to emerge, and you're beginning to recognize that you're having that feeling, well, you know that that feeling is often associated with making, a certain type of mistake. And so you want to be able to have an association between your internal state and your behavior. That's a really critical part of trading. So, I just want to review here a little bit. Going from stage 1 to stage 2 requires that you learn a trading method or a strategy, and that you learn how the strategy plays itself out in the market. And going from stage 2 to stage 3 is really where most traders are going to run into problems. Closing that gap, so to speak, from stage 2 to stage 3 is largely a psychological issue, and that's going to involve self-confidence. It's going to involve getting to know yourself. It's going to involve understanding your internal state. And once you're in stage 3, what you want to do in stage 3 is you want to be able to really identify what's working and what's not working, and you want to obviously do more of what's working and less of what doesn't. Again, I know that sounds obvious, but believe it or not, most traders never ever do that. They talk about it, but they never actually do it. All right, so moving on. What makes you tick is what makes the market tick. Okay, obviously, on any given day, 50 to 70% of whatever instrument you're trading, 50 to 70% of the volume of whatever instrument you might be trading, speaking more about an equity or an index future like the ES, might be due to algos or bots and computers. So yes, there's not as many humans actually clicking the mouse nowadays, but really what's going on in trading is that there's a lot of emotion in the market. And so what I'm going to suggest that people think about is the game Liar's Poker. Not the book Liar's Poker, but the game Liar's Poker. Liar's Poker is a game that's played on a lot of trading desks on trading floors during slow times. And basically what it is, it's basically a game where the winner is the one who can bluff the best and manage their emotions, bluff the best, and also read the emotions of others. Well, basically that's trading in a nutshell right there. And the people who do really well at Liar's Poker are the people who are able to assess their own emotions very quickly, and they're able to manage their emotions, and then they do their bluff, and simultaneously while they're doing this, they're reading the emotions of their competitor, of the person they're playing against, and they're trying to take advantage of them, obviously. So really what I'm trying to say here in a long-winded way is that the market is not moved by precision and logic. The market is essentially moved by perception and emotion. So what you need to do is you need to focus on your own emotion, your own perception, and you need to focus on doing what is right, not on being right. We never know if a trade is going to work. It's not our job to know if a trade is going to work. All we can do is focus on doing the right thing at any given time. And the more that you're going to learn, the more you learn to understand your feelings. And when I talk about emotions and feelings, one thing I'm not talking much about in this presentation because it would kind of take too long to get into it, but very often emotions and feelings can actually be subconscious. We're not actually aware of them. That's a whole other ballgame, and maybe we'll talk about that some other time. Maybe I can actually address it when we get to the question and answer period at the end. But the more you learn to understand your feelings within the context in which they occur, the more control that you're going to have over your behavior, and the more you're going to understand the feelings of other market participants, and you're going to be able to position yourself to take advantage, or I should say maybe be a real competitor on the market playing field. Because believe me, you're up against some pretty hard competition out there. So again, you want to think of the Liar's Poker example. The people who make it in trading are the people who know how to read their own emotions, and they can read the emotions of others. I want to kind of, before I leave this one slide, I also just want to say that really improving performance, it involves changing behavior. And as a psychologist, I'm going to tell you that it might seem difficult at first to change your behavior, but actually it comes fairly naturally when you start to attend to and learn about your thoughts and your feelings and the patterns that exist. That type of awareness will allow you to create an internal structure that will allow you to begin to behave differently. Okay, we can all change how we behave using behavior modification techniques. We can use exposure techniques, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. There's a lot of great behavior mod, a lot of basic psych techniques that we can use. But I'm going to say this is something that I've personally experienced, and I've seen this firsthand, that the behavior mod stuff really works, but it has its limitation. And here's the limitation. If you want the new behavior that you've kind of conditioned for yourself to generalize beyond the very specific scenario that you've conditioned, then you need to, and you want to be adaptive to new situations, I should say, then it's really ultimately best that if you also attend to your emotions. So what I'm suggesting here is you kind of have to have a two-pronged approach. You need to deal with, you want to do behavior modification, you want to do exposure, you want to do operant conditioning, classical conditioning. We can talk about that stuff at the end. But you also don't want to leave out your emotions, because otherwise, every time a new situation appears that you didn't actually condition yourself for it, you're not going to know what to do, and you're going to find yourself in a kind of an internal chaotic state. Okay, so let's get into some practical stuff. Unexpressed emotion, basically, and I'm kind of doing some psych talk here for you guys. Unexpressed emotion is unintegrated emotion, and unintegrated emotion essentially is going to lead to internal chaos. All right, I'm going to tell you a little something. I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but before I got involved in the trading world, which was back in '95, before that in the early '90s, I worked as a civilian contractor, as a psychologist for the Defense Department for the Navy. And I can tell you, I've talked with and I've worked with some special forces, special ops folks, and one of the strategies that they use is they understand that it's actually that a human can focus when they're in pain, but they really can't focus when they're experiencing chaos. And so they will actually create a chaotic situation. They'll create chaos in the environment to kind of lay the groundwork before they make their attack. And so chaos is you want to basically avoid internal chaos whenever you can. And one of the ways you can do that is you want to make sure that you're in touch with your emotions. And here's a nice little way you can do that. And I'm not talking about controlling your emotions. I'm just kind of using the word rule, R-U-L-E, as a way to kind of remember what to do with your emotions. And you want to recognize the emotion. In a sense, basically what you want to do there is trying to, assess it, recognize that it's there. You want to try and understand it. I'm not going to get too far into detail here because, again, I want to, I'm looking at the time and I realize that I have about 6 more slides I want to get to before we get to the questions. So I'm going to kind of rip through this a little bit quickly, and hopefully we'll kind of come back around to it in the questions. But basically, ignored emotions are unintegrated emotions, and unintegrated emotional states are going to trigger automatic, reactive, and often unwanted behaviors. And if you've ever tried to change the way you behave, how you take action, but you found that you still repeat the same mistakes, it's highly probable that you have unexpressed and unintegrated emotion. Okay? A great example is the impulse trade, right? The classic impulse trade that every trader has done at some point or another. And essentially the impulse trade is when you jump into the market because you feel like you're going to miss the move. And really what it is when you act on an impulse from a psychological point of view, what you're doing is you're acting out unexpressed emotion. So if you can get that emotion expressed, and when I say expressed, I'm talking about ideally, if you can verbalize it, say it out loud, or at least say it in your head, or at least write it down on a piece of paper if you're on a trading desk. you want to express that emotion, because an expressed emotion is going to be a lot less dangerous for you. A lot of our unintegrated internal states are associated with internal distress when we're a trader, because we're facing a lot of dilemmas, we're facing constant uncertainty, we're facing constant ambiguity, and because of that, it's very easy to kind of find yourself kind of with experiencing an internal state of chaos, or possibly even being overly rigid is sort of the other end of the spectrum. You can be very chaotic internally, or also very rigid, and that's also a problem. Or you can sort of have a combination of both, rigidity and chaos. It's also possible. I've seen that too. So what happens then if you're feeling chaos inside, or you're feeling overly rigid, obviously you're behaviorally compromised. And more importantly, what that means is that you're not going to be able to adapt to the situation, and you're not going to be able to act in your own best interest. You know, humans, basically what we do is, as a trader, I'm going to say, we use data, we use logic, we use patterns to justify our trade decisions, right? But in the heat of the moment, where that rubber meets the road, it's our emotions that are going to have the last say, and those emotions are easily going to trump our thoughts, and those emotions are going to basically be responsible for when our finger hits the mouse. Okay, a little bit about the link between emotions and behavior. So like I said earlier, we're not going to ever eliminate emotions. We can learn to manage our emotions, and we can learn to not be a victim of our emotions. So I want to ask you guys a question, or maybe it's a homework assignment for you. I want you to think about this and answer it. You don't need to type it in the window, but something to think about is, which is the bigger obstacle for you? Being aware of your internal state, or accepting your internal state? Okay? Accepting your internal state, whatever it is, whether it's anger, regret, fear, pleasure, doesn't matter. It's not this. Well, I should say this. It's not the same as acting out on your internal state. That's a very, very critical point. Understanding your internal state and acting out on your internal state, that's a really, really, really big point. In fact, it's one of the most, it's probably one of the areas that I end up spending the most amount of time on when I work with traders. And what I'm going to say is this, and hopefully you guys will understand this. There is a tiny window of opportunity that exists between an emotion or feeling and when we actually take action. And that is the window that will make or break a trader. And I've seen too many traders who are unaware of this little window, or they've closed the gap, so to speak. And so what I like to do is I will work with traders to open it back up, open up that window to basically create more space or more time, depending upon how you experience it. Some people experience it as time, some people experience it as space, different ways to experience it, but essentially there is a gap between an emotion and the behavior that follows it. And you want to get a handle on that space, on that gap, and you want to work within that, because that's where you have the opportunity to decide whether you're going to act in your own best interest despite what your other emotions might be wanting you to do. And I'm going to, one of my favorite definitions of insanity, and this is not really the clinical definition of insanity. I'm sure if there's any psychologist or psychiatrist listening, they're going to say, what is he talking about? But my favorite definition of insanity is this, and it's basically when we repeatedly do the same thing over and over and over, but we're expecting different results. That's insanity, okay? If you're not able to make money trading, the bottom line is that you've got to start doing something different. And I think one way to begin doing that is to get a handle on your internal state. And ultimately, in an ideal way, what you want to do is you really want to start working with that space or that moment in time between an emotion and the action that follows it. Emotions have a huge, huge impact on our behavior. And I'll just give you a little story about this. I'm not going to mention any names, but on an institutional level, sometimes I've seen them actually train the brokers, train the brokers to not use certain words when they're talking to the clients. And you see this a lot with like retail stockbrokers especially. The brokers are taught not to tell their clients to, quote, exit that losing position, unquote. They don't want to use the word losing. Rather, the broker is taught to tell their client something more like, we need to transfer your funds into something which is a better opportunity. So what they're doing is they're avoiding the word loss. They don't even want to have the loss discussion. Instead, they're going to use the word like transfer, because closing out a losing position well, basically transferring money from one position to another has a much less emotional charge to it than actually closing out a losing position. So I got a little sidetracked there, but I just wanted to share that little ditty with you guys. All right, so moving on. A path of least resistance. Anyone who's seen any of my presentations in the past may recognize this slide. It's one I've used before. It's one of my favorite slides. And basically, what I'm trying to impart here to you is that in the market, price follows the path of least resistance, right? We all know that. And what I'm going to tell you is that the human mind tends to follow the path of least resistance as well. And what that is for the human mind is that we are constantly seeking comfort, and we're constantly trying to avoid pain or discomfort. So what I'm going to suggest here is that while price follows the path of least resistance, the path that we must follow as a trader may involve pushing ourselves beyond our comfort level. In other words, as traders, there are times we must take the path of most resistance. I'm talking about on an internal basis. We may need to push through the fear, push through the discomfort, push through the negative emotion in order to act in our own best interest. We have to pitch out that loser. We have to control our risk. We have to learn to actually take that path of most resistance internally while we're watching price take the path of least resistance. Now, the good news is that it's easily done with practice. Well, I don't want to say it's easily done. I mean, it takes practice. It actually takes hard work. But it is very possible, and it just takes practice. And, you know, a common pattern here for a trader, I just want to mention a really brief little example, is that a common pattern for a trader who's in a drawdown, or they're red for the day or for the week, or what happens is two things will either happen for this trader, and it's very common. They either press really hard, they kind of gun it, they push really too hard, and they end up in a situation where they're really their head is spinning. And either that, or they are doing what I said earlier, is they're eating like a bird and pooping like an elephant. They're taking small little profits, but letting those losers get out of control because they're imagining each loser is going to be the one that's going to come back and be the big one that gets them back on top. And of course, that's the smoking opium trade. And so I say, put your pipes away, and instead, what you need to do is you need to learn to follow the path of most resistance on an internal basis, in an internal level, I should say. And again, it's not all that difficult. There are ways to do it, and that's what I do as a trading psychologist. I actually work with people on basically how to kind of deal with that path of resistance internally. So let's see, I'm just kind of looking ahead with my slides. Okay, I think I've got enough time here to kind of rip through these. I'm going to have to kind of go quickly here because I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the questions and the answers. Trevor, just want to check in with you. How are we doing on time?
We're good. We're fine. I'm assuming an hour and a half total. That's what we should try and keep it under. So we're just coming up on an hour.
Okay, great. I might go a little bit beyond the hour with the actual presentation, the formal presentation, because I do want to get everything in here if I can, and then because I also want to leave time for the Q&A, obviously. So with this particular slide we're looking at right now, the power of observation and acceptance. Okay, very powerful. There's a lot of ways you can do this, and I don't want to get too caught up in details here, but basically, lack of internal awareness means lack of choice of behavior. Okay, when you have emotions that you are aware of and you accept them, then you have the ability to decide whether you're going to act on them or not. So what I'm going to tell you is that you need to learn to become the observer of your own internal state, the observer of your trading, and the observer of who you are. And if you do that, your trading will improve. And there's lots of ways you can do that. Emotion analytics, which is charting your emotions journaling, but when I say journaling, a lot of people will leave out their emotions in their journal entries, but I would suggest that you actually have a separate journal for emotions or incorporate emotions in your journal. Biofeedback is another way. There's a lot of ways that you can begin to learn to become the observer of your own process. You know, acting in our own best interest as a trader is obviously, it's difficult to do on a consistent basis. And awareness of our internal state is going to put us on that path towards moving closer to acting in our own best interest. Awareness is a great start, but ultimately it takes more than awareness to act in our own best interest in an emotionally charged situation like the market. And the market is almost always emotionally charged if you're in it. So, you know, you need to really understand the power of observation and acceptance, okay? Now, I do want to say that there are a few rare individuals, not many at all, very, very rare. It's you might be one of them, but it's not too likely. I'd say there's maybe about 1% out there who are actually able to ignore their internal state entirely and still act in their own best interest. Most people are unable to do that. And so for that reason, most traders really do need to learn how to become aware of their internal state and learn how to accept the discomfort that might be associated with their internal state, or that internal state is going to turn into internal chaos. And it's generally easier to focus when you're in pain, when you're in discomfort. That's okay. That's part of trading. Trading involves discomfort. It's much easier to focus when you're in discomfort. You do not want that discomfort to transform or morph into chaos, because focusing during chaos is virtually impossible. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about self-confidence specifically here, and what it is and what it isn't. And, you know, self-confidence goes beyond positive thinking, okay? I'm going to say that positive thinking is very necessary, and it's critically important to have a positive attitude. And affirmations can be wonderful. Having a positive image, having a positive vision, those are all good tools to use. But what I am going to say is that positive thinking is necessary, but it's not sufficient by itself, okay? And the reason for that is that real self-confidence, the way I define it, is that real self-confidence is actually resilience in the face of disappointment. You know, most traders are going to feel their confidence going up and down with their account P&L, right? As your account equity swells, your confidence swells. Your account equity goes down, your confidence goes down. That's very common. If you find that that's happening for you, that's a red flag, because it's a setup for a common pattern. Well, it's a red flag for a few reasons. One, it's a red flag because it means you may not actually have true self-confidence, okay? Because, like I said, true self-confidence is when you can be resilient in the face of disappointment. And we all know trading, there's always going to be disappointments in trading. It's part of the business. So, you know, I want to say this too, there's a very common pattern of traders who will make a bunch of money rather quickly, and then they give it back even faster than they made it. And usually that's somebody you'll watch, you'll see that their confidence and their self-esteem is swinging along with their account equity. And again, that's just not a good sign if that happens. You need to get a handle on it. Your self-confidence needs to be pretty much solid regardless of where your account equity is. Pardon me. So, you know, again, real confidence is resilience in the face of disappointment. I want people to really understand that's truly what confidence, especially as a trader. Okay, I'm not talking about confidence in other areas of life. The market is very unique, and it's unlike any other experience. It's unlike any other profession. And because of that, self-confidence has a unique definition for a trader. It's not like confidence in other areas of our life. And we need to really understand that. Okay. Another way to look at self-confidence is that, you know, when we are able to understand what goes on inside of us and have a handle on it, basically, and we recognize what's going on inside of us, but yet we are able to make a choice as to whether we decide to act on that feeling or not. When you start to do that more and more and more, your confidence will actually start to go up. Basically what I'm talking about is kind of working on your own inner foundation. It's kind of like building a house or remodeling a house, right? You can't just add a second floor. Usually it's going to require some work on the foundation first. And the part of the house, it's the part of the house that you can't see, right? And so for us, it's what we can't see. It's our internal state. It's our emotions. It's our feelings. And sometimes, like I said earlier, we may not even be aware of those feelings and thoughts, or I should say not thoughts, but we're not even aware of those feelings and emotions. Again, that's a kind of a separate topic. Maybe I'll do another webinar down the road on that. But you really want to have a solid foundation, which is essentially being aware of and accepting your internal state. And then you can start to really kind of layer on top of that the positive thinking. But positive thinking by itself is not going to get you where you want to be as a trader. I also just want to say that positive thoughts and beliefs, use them to create a vision, use them to create a goal. Let them, don't stop doing them. I encourage you to do them, but just don't only rely on those, okay? So building the right type of confidence. Okay, I'm going to talk a lot about this towards the end, but the first two areas, self-understanding, self-acceptance, I've kind of touched on. I may have touched on focus on process, not on outcomes, but that's a really, really big thing. Essentially what I'm saying here is that if you can focus on your process, and really what it comes down to is, we don't have a lot we can control as a trader, right? We can control, the way we sit, we can control, our immediate environment, we can control our body, but we can't really control much beyond that. So what we want to do is focus on the process of, or the things that we do have, within our control, the things that are within that process of control. And so some of those things might include your trading preparation, your position sizing, how patient you are you tracking your own emotions, are you predefining and truly emotionally accepting the risk, are you aware of your arousal, your anxiety level, are you doing something to manage it? Those are things, those are examples of focusing on the process. And I'm going to tell you, there's kind of a magical thing that happens. When you actually focus on the process and you have a trading method which is, either has a positive expectancy or you just have confidence in that method because you, for whatever reason, you think it's going to work or it's going to work. If you focus on the process, the outcomes will take care of themselves. And it's hard to believe, but too many people are focusing on the outcome. They get into a trade, and they're focusing on whether the trade is going to be right or wrong. And of course, you can't help but ignore that, and we're always going to be wondering and thinking and worrying about it, and that's normal. But if really what's going to benefit you the most as a trader is to try and focus your attention, your mental attention, your energy, not on that outcome, but on your actual process as a trader. And what's going to happen here is, let me give you an example from outside of trading and sports, because I actually know some sports psychologists, folks that work with elite athletes. I myself, I've actually worked with a couple of folks, not athletes, but I've actually worked with some performing artists, people who, I've worked with folks backstage or on a tour bus before they go out on stage and kind of with their process. And I'll give you an example from sports. An athlete is going to keep their eye on the ball, right? And the ball is the process. They're not staring at the scoreboard. Right, they're developing their own. Well, I don't want to say they're developing, but by keeping their eye on the ball, essentially, is the way they keep their focus on the process. I don't want to get too lost in that because I want to save time for questions. So, I do want to say this though: many traders have a strong need to be right, and what happens is they end up hurting their account because of this really strong need. And what I'm going to tell you is that by shifting your focus to the process and away from the outcome, you are taking a lot of pressure off yourself, and you're giving yourself a chance to do something right. And that's really important in trading. Feeling good, regardless of whether the trade made money or not, is a wonderful thing. And I'm going to say that if you follow your process, and you followed your plan, and you did everything correctly, and the trade just was an unproductive trade, it didn't make money, that's still a good thing. That should build confidence for you, okay? I also just want to say, too, about leveraging your strengths, and this is a bit of a sort of something that's misunderstood by a lot of people in terms of strengths and weaknesses. There's a lot of people out there that will try and work on their weaknesses and turn a weakness into a strength. And I'm going to say that that is very admirable, but as a trader, we have a limited amount of energy and time, and we really want to get results. And I'm going to tell you that the fastest way to get results really is to not focus on your weaknesses and turning them into a strength, but really to focus on leveraging what you already have as a strength. Okay, and you get a much bigger bang out of trying to build up a strength or leveraging a strength and building on a weakness. And I'm not saying ignore your weaknesses, but really identify your strengths and leverage them to the hilt. Okay, so here we are, the relationship between confidence and discipline. Okay, a lot of these things I've already talked about that are on the slide. Everyone talks about discipline, but really the most important attribute in trading beyond discipline, I say, is the precursor to discipline, and that's just true self-confidence, which is really knowing yourself, being resilient in the face of disappointment. And when you have a foundation of true self-confidence in place, it's going to become a lot easier to do the right thing. We always want to do the right thing as a trader. It's much more important than being right. Okay, if you just remember any one thing from this presentation, is actually, I should say, two things. The two takeaways would be to always remember that it's much more important to do the right thing than it is to be right. And then the other thing I want you to always to remember from this presentation is to ask yourself, am I acting in my own best interest right now? Those sound like really simple, easy things, and if you're able to do those very consistently and follow what I just suggested, I'm not going to say I guarantee because I can't control what you do, but you're going to see a change in your trading for the better. There's a lot of things we can do as a trader, and I'm going to say that we've all heard the classic question of, do you want to be right or do you want to make money, right? We all know that question, and what I've done is I've kind of changed that question around a little bit. And rather than saying, do you want to be right or do you want to make money, I kind of rephrase it as a trader, we have to focus on doing what's right and not on being right. And I know that it sounds like I'm kind of repeating myself and that I may be splitting hairs here, but when you actually operationalize the statement, what I mean by operationalize is I mean that rather than just having this abstract idea of do I want to make money or do I want to be right, that's a nice abstract statement. But it's better to kind of turn it into a process where you actually make it into an operation, an operationalized behavior that you're going to engage in. So the way you do that is you take that statement from do I want to be right or make money, and you turn it into am I doing the right thing versus am I trying to just be right in this particular moment. It's really going to help to force you to focus on that process, and it's going to have the effect of making you more aware of all those common mental biases and traps, loss aversion, confirmation bias, endowment effect, all that stuff that everyone knows about. But what most people don't know about is being able to recognize when those mental biases are just around the corner and they're about to grab hold of you and cause you to do something really stupid. Okay, so this, Trevor, by the way, this is the last slide, and after this we can kind of do some Q&A. So basically, I've got a zillion tips and techniques, and I've just got 10 of them on here for folks to kind of consider. And the first one is cover your P&L, or in other words, don't look at your P&L while trading. And the reason for that is you want to trade the market. You don't want to be trading your P&L. Okay. Tracking average hold time of a winner versus a loser is really important too. You can get a lot of information about yourself and about your trading. That one particular trading stat, I believe, is possibly the most important trading stat of all. I talked about the rule, R-U-L-E. Okay, you want to try and incorporate that into your trading if you can. And that's related to number 4, emotion analytics, where essentially you're going to be charting or journaling your emotions. And mental rehearsal we talked about, identifying strengths. A lot of these things we've talked about already, but I just wanted to have them all in one slide for folks to see. Basically at the bottom of the, at the end of the day, the bottom line essentially is that if you believe that you're getting in your own way as a trader, and I believe that we pretty much all do at some point or another, if you can understand that, and if you do believe that, then you simply need to do something to address that. And just thinking about it and talking about it and reading about it may not be enough. I mean, there's a lot of great trading psychology books, and I've read, not all of them, but I've read a lot of them, and there's some really good books out there. And a lot of them, they leave you with kind of like that aha experience, like, wow, I can relate to what the author just wrote. That's me right there. And you feel like they're really speaking to you, and you feel like you've really learned something from the book. Well, then you're sitting at your trading desk, and you end up making the same mistake over and over and over, the same thing that they just talked about in the book. So really what I'm going to say here is many times it takes more than reading a book. It actually takes doing something differently for yourself. And I want people to, take something from this webinar, do something with yourself. Don't just keep it up in your head and intellectualize it, but actually make it real, operationalize it, and make a change tomorrow when you start trading. Okay? And basically, that's what I have today for content. And at this point, I guess we can kind of open it up to questions, Trevor. If you want to kind of help me with that, that'd be great.
Okay, so if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. There's no way that we're going to probably be able to cover all the questions that come in. I'll go ahead and throw the question at Andrew, and he can give us his answer. So here's a few I've already flagged that have come in no particular order here. Can you recommend a book on behavioral finance for experienced traders? Do you have a...
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of good books. I'll give you one that I like a lot, and it's actually not just for experienced traders, but it's really for everybody, and it's called Your Money in Your Brain by Jason Zweig, Z-W-E-I-G. It's a very easy read, actually. It's actually quite accessible, pretty entertaining. It's not one of those books that's heavily laden with a lot of academic theory. He takes the academic and the science stuff, and he turns it into an actually a very readable format. And it's a great book. And just by coincidence, I'm not endorsing the book. I don't get anything out of you buying the book, but a friend of mine is actually his sister-in-law. But I think it's a great book, and it's the one that I would recommend in terms of behavioral finance.
Okay, next question. What is HRV and biofeedback? Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, great question. I was anticipating that question. HRV stands for heart rate variability, and it's a particular way it's a particular type of biofeedback. And what biofeedback is, essentially, there's a lot of different ways of using biofeedback, but what it is you're trying to get feedback as to what's going on with your body. And so HRV is you're getting feedback as to what's going on with your heart rate variability. And I use a device called an M-Wave, E-M-W-A-V-E. You can actually go to emwave.com or heartmath.com, HEARTMATH.com, and they have the devices that I'm talking about. And basically what they're used for, a lot of professional athletes who use these, more and more traders are using these devices. Essentially, it's a way for you to control not just your heart rate, but your heart rate variability, which is essentially the peaks and valleys on an EKG. When you have a smoother heart rate variability, when it's a smoother EKG, it's often associated with a much calmer mental state, and you're able to actually, obviously, when you're in a calmer mental state, you're going to make better decisions for yourself.
Okay, next question. Will you contrast how self-confidence in trading is different than self-confidence in other areas of your life?
Sure. That's a big question. I'll try and answer it as best I can without without writing a book about it, because it's a really big area. I'll give you an example, maybe kind of contrasting trading, maybe from sports. In sports, if you're an athlete and you're about to get into a competition, you want to have confidence in what you're in yourself and in your body and in your skills, and you're going to do a lot of visualization around. Athletes do a lot of visualization, by the way, around the best positive outcome for that particular game or that particular competition. But in trading is different, because in trading we have absolutely no control over what we're actually trading. An athlete can have some control over their environment, right? They can move the ball around, they can do this, they can offset the opponent, they can do all kinds of things. But in trading, there's not, unless you're trading with humongous size, there's not a lot you can do in trading to control the market. And so self-confidence as a trader requires that you have to be prepared for the inevitable disappointment. And I'm going to say that it's so inevitable that you pretty much have to expect it and you have to prepare for it. And so really being confident in your, not just in your method, but in yourself is really critical. And outside of trading, it's similar, but within trading, you have to really be more prepared for those disappointments.
All right, next question. Can you give us an example of leveraging your strengths?
Sure. I'll give you a personal example from myself, from my own trading. The way I trade is I trade the ES, and I use a lot of I'm not a strict market profiler, but I use market profile, and my trading style is I tend to take maybe 2, 3, 4, not too many trades a day. I tend to try and catch the larger moves of the day. And so what I will do is I noticed early on in my trading that one of my strengths was I was able to actually, a lot of people have a hard time holding on to a trade, holding on to a winner. Well, I recognized right away that I was actually able to hold on to winners pretty easily. My initial problem with trading was that I had to get rid of those losers quickly. That was my problem. So my strength was holding a winner. So what I did to leverage that is over time, as I got better, I started to build up my size, and I'm going to say I built it up slowly. I'm not telling anyone to build up their size, and if you do build up your size, do it very slowly, please. But what I did is I built up my size slowly over time, and I learned to scale out, and that would actually help me to hold on to the winners longer. And there's probably some folks in this room who've seen me trade. I'm sorry, people who are in this webinar who've seen me trade. I'm sure I recognize a lot of names who've seen me post my live trades, entries and exits, and they've seen me hold, trades for like the majority of the day and get a lot of points out of it. And that's a strength that I've had, and I've leveraged it over time. It's not something that I was able to do from the very, very beginning, but I did recognize early on as a trader that was one of my strengths, and so I just basically built on it.
Okay, good. Next question is, how do we bridge the gap between knowing what to do intellectually versus acting on it physically?
Boy, that's really the million-dollar question, right? And so what you want to do really is a lot of different things for yourself. You want to essentially get in touch with what those feelings are inside. You want to get inside. You want to basically get inside yourself a little bit and be in touch with your feelings, because, like I said earlier, there is a very small gap, a very small window of opportunity between that emotion and the action or the behavior that follows it. So what you can do for yourself is, some people get involved in meditation, where they learn to become the observer of their own thoughts. Biofeedback is a way to do it. Personally, I happen to meditate myself. I try and do it every day if I can, but honestly, I don't always have the time to. Meditation can be a wonderful way to kind of learn to kind of expand that gap again between the emotion and the behavior. I hope I'm answering the question. But again, reading the books is great, and I suggest that you do read the books. A lot of great articles and information. I've got a blog on my website. I write a lot about trading psychology. I do a lot of stuff on Twitter. Actually, I'll put up the last slide here if you guys want to follow me on Twitter. Basically, what you want to do is you want to focus on your process, and that process means a lot of things. Process of observing yourself, process of understanding what you're feeling inside. You really want to focus on the process. Focus on the process.
Okay, real good. These two, actually there's a whole bunch that tend to deal with undoing frustration, dealing with negative thought patterns, things like that. Can you comment on that, or is that all just related to the whole process that you're referring to?
Well, I mean, I can speak to that certainly, and that happens to everybody. And so what I will do for myself is, and I recommend this to other folks too, is that if you're in a situation where you're frustrated, if you can, it's best if you can get up and get out of your chair, get away from the immediate environment where you're being frustrated. Essentially, step away from the screen and do something for yourself. Stretch out your body. When I talk about doing something with your body, stretch out, do some breathing. The reason I talk about doing something with your body is because the physical route is actually the fastest way to change your emotional, whatever emotion you're feeling. You can actually get to that emotion and actually potentially alter it. The most effective way is often through the physical route. Now, that physical route isn't going to permanently change the emotion. You might still be frustrated later, and there might be an overhang of anger and resentment or whatever, and regret, but you can very effectively, very quickly in time, it's kind of like emotional first aid is basically the physical route. Do something with your body. Get outside, take a quick walk, take some deep breaths, stretch yourself out.
Yeah, that was good. What are your thoughts on subconscious training with respect to trading?
Well, that's a big question, and that can cover anything from I suppose hypnotherapy to subliminal affirmations on a CD to all kinds of things. And I believe that we should do whatever works, right? And if you find that you're doing something that works, do more of it. I personally do, for myself, I do engage in certain techniques that I will use for myself. And depending upon the person I'm working with, if they're open to certain techniques, I will teach them as well. Working on a subconscious level, I believe, is important. It's very important, but it's easier said than done, and it really ultimately what it's going to require, and this is the hard part why most people can't really do it, is that it requires a lot of self-honesty. You have to be extremely honest with yourself and be extremely willing to look at your own personal demons if you're going to work on your subconscious level. A lot of people recognize that the subconscious is the area where it's tripping them up and they need to get a handle on it, but unless you're going to be brutally honest with yourself, that's really the requirement for working on that subconscious level first. That's kind of the premise before you even get to that. So,
Here's a question. Can you give us an example of an emotional journal entry?
Sure. Yeah. So what I do is I will, I don't do this all the time myself. Honestly, to confession, I don't keep my emotions on a journal anymore every day. I do sometimes, but what I used to do, and I will teach other people to do this now, is on a journal have 3 columns, where the first column is the situation, the second column is your self-talk, or what you're telling yourself, or maybe what you're feeling inside, and the third column is the outcome, or actually what you did and the result of what you did. So basically you can kind of see right there in front of you a relationship between the situation, what you're telling yourself and what you're feeling, and then the outcome of the situation.
Okay, a couple questions, or I can answer them, I guess, just with respect to these slides. This is being recorded and will be posted to our blog tomorrow, so you'll have the slides that way. There's a question. Do you think subliminal tapes will have a positive effect for a trader?
I think they can, and I would say that there's one limitation in those, and I touched on it a little bit in the presentation, and that is that if you have an inner foundation, in other words, some real subconscious demons lurking inside, no amount of subliminal stuff is really going to help in terms of permanently turning you around. You might get a temporary fix out of it, but you really also need to deal with what's going on a very deep level. So the answer to that is yes and no.
All right, here's a good one. Recognizing that so much of my competition is machines, meaning computers or algorithms, and they have no emotions to manage, what advantage do I have as an emotional trader over the competition, and how do I leverage this?
Well, that's a great question, and you're right. I don't know what instrument the person trades who asked the question, but even though machines or bots and algos are responsible for a lot of the volume and what you're trading, there are other participants trading, and I'm also going to say that who's programming those algos, right? They're humans, and so there are certain basic psychological facts that when the market is moving up everyone's going to want to jump on, right? And when the market's moving down, people are going to want to have a short bias. People are going to want to get, a lot of folks get short in the hole. So really what you want to do is you want to be able to start thinking in a way that is, well, let me back up and just say that you want to essentially take that path of least resistance and not kind of go down that path that the market kind of wants to lull you into. The market's going to want you, those bots, those other folks, those other machines, whatever. I don't want to create paranoia here, but there are systems of trading out there that's designed to basically, obviously run stops and to get people off sides. So you want to recognize that, and you want to be able to realize that that's what you're up against, and so maybe you need to be doing the opposite.
All right. How do you accept fear if that is your internal state? Example, if I don't let my winners run because I'm afraid price will turn on me before my target is met.
So how do you handle the fear? How do you work?
Yeah, how do you accept fear if this is your internal state?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I do is, I'm going to use the biofeedback example, is I will sometimes have myself hooked up to my biofeedback device while I'm trading, or somebody I'm working with, I'll have them hooked up to their device. And what that will do for them is they will get a visual readout, and they will see right there on their screen, on the software, on the biofeedback software, is their if they take 5 long, slow, deep breaths, they're going to see that their EKG smooths out. Well, a smoothed out EKG is generally going to be associated with less fear. So one of the things you can do is to really focus on your breathing to kind of control the extreme emotions that you might be feeling. I mean, breathing, like I said earlier, the physical route is often the fastest route to make an impact on your emotions, and breathing is probably one of the quickest and fastest ways you can do it. Long, slow, deep breaths.
All right. I find for myself that my self-confidence becomes or breeds arrogance. What can help me find the right balance to ensure that I consistently utilize it for sake of discipline?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll be honest with you and make a confession in that I've been in the same boat myself many times, and that I can, I'll have a good run, and then I get kind of think I got it all dialed in, and then I put too much leverage on, and of course we know what happens then. So what I'm going to say is that what you want to do is you want to recognize the fact that you are feeling overconfident, first of all. Okay, it goes back to what I said earlier in the presentation. If you have a handle on your internal state, which may include being overly confident, then you start to recognize that overconfidence is just basically one step away from being arrogant. And being arrogant is basically just one step away from doing something stupid. So really what you want to do is you want to check it at the door, get a handle on it very quickly, and recognize it as it's just beginning to materialize in the form of kind of swelling confidence. Like I said earlier, if you notice your confidence swinging up and down with your account equity, that's another red flag.
All right. I guess this is the last question, but basically there's a lot of people asking for you to recommend the biofeedback device. I know you mentioned it, but if you maybe type it in the chat, so people can see it.
Let's see. I'm going to type it in here. Let's see. I'm trying to type it, Trevor, and it's actually not.
Type in the little chat window, not the questions window.
Okay. Oh, I see. There we go. All right. So I'm going to type in 2 different URLs, and it's the same company. I think it has a different landing page. Let's see. Make sure I type this in correctly so I don't send you guys to the wrong website. There's one, and HeartMath is the other. And basically, there's two products that they have available. They have a PSR, stands for Portable Stress Reliever unit, the PSR unit, and I have that. I also have the full-blown desktop software version as well. The PSR is like a pocket thing. You can put it in your pocket. You can walk around with it. Golfers use it on the golf course. It's something you can use in the car. You can take it around. It's very portable. I have both. I also like to use the desktop as right here when I'm trading.
Okay, let's wrap it up with that. We're pretty much at our hour-and-a-half limit. Is there any final things you wanted to add, Andrew?
Well, I was going to say that, I would encourage people to follow me on Twitter, because what I like to do on Twitter, on my Twitter stream, is I do post little psychological nuggets of wisdom throughout the trading day. Maybe it'll help kind of keep you on the right side of the market, maybe help to remind you to do the right thing rather than being focused on being right. Maybe it'll help you to focus on acting in your own best interest. And if you have any questions, I've got my email address up here on that slide, and feel free to get hold of me. And that's about it.
All right. Then the last thing I have to say is this was recorded, including the Q&A time. It'll be posted to our blog tomorrow morning, although I'll make sure everybody that signed up should get an email with a link to the recording. You can download it as well. So check for an email probably tomorrow on that. Other than that, certainly thank you, Andrew, for doing this. We really appreciate it, and everybody have a great evening.
Thank you, Trevor, for hosting. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, see you, everybody.
Make it a great day, guys. Bye-bye.